Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Kate Collins and I'm a Senior Manager in the Large and Strategic Partnerships team at Homes England. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Summer Learning Programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you've told us are of interest to you. Today's event will cover the foundations of green infrastructure for high quality places. This Summer Learning Programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. And the topic of this session is an important focus in Homes England's new strategic plan. The slides that you can see now show you the new mission and objectives outlined in our new strategic plan. And the slide summarises who the Local Government Capacity Centre are and what it is that we do. We established the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. We look forward to hearing how we did at the end of the poll at the end of this session. So the next slide, please. So on the slide now, you'll see the breakdown of today's session. So there'll be, after this welcome and introductions, there'll be an introduction to green infrastructure by Dr. Lee Heacoop. And then we'll have a session on the essential ingredients for high quality green infrastructure by Dr. Gemma Jerome. We'll then have a section on green infrastructure framework, so the principles and standards for England, and that will be by Jane Horton. And that will be followed by a session on the England Green Infrastructure Mapping Database by Martin Moss. And then finally, we'll have a question and answer session at the end, and that will be chaired by Dr. Lee Heacoop. So at the end of that, we'll be drawing the session to a close with a further poll to get some immediate feedback on the session. So I'm now going to hand you over to our first presenter, Dr. Lee Heacoop, who is a landscape manager in the Sustainability and Design Implementation team at Homes England. So I'll hand you over now.
Thank you, Kate. Next slide, please. So green stuff has moved up the agenda. It was regarded just a few years ago, it seems to me, as a maintenance liability, places for dispensable leisure pursuits, a decorative nice to have, and now it's known as an essential asset of urban living, a tool for climate resilience, a major health benefit, and an important place attractor. It does a lot to help us. As you can see, right-hand column, it does a lot to help the climate emergency, polluted air, children and young people's mental health crisis, the inactivity crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the ageing health crisis. And if you haven't heard much about the last one, please do Google it and find out more. So the image on the left-hand side is a road that's adjacent to West India Dock Road, just opposite Canary Wharf in Tower Hamlets. And it kind of shows, what happens when green infrastructure and its maintenance is seen as a liability. It's value engineered. Many of us know how much green infrastructure has been value engineered downwards. And on the right hand side, by contrast, is the Barbican planting there by Nigel Dunnett and how much that helps such a hard urban landscape. So in terms of that, value engineering, that has gone right through the sector. Green skills and knowledge have been repeatedly savaged by budget cuts. Even now, some of the worst paid jobs are in this sector, and yet it's vital to us all. So we now face a skill shortage right through the sector as a result, even at the same time as we see this green stuff as essential to urban living. Next slide, please. So green infrastructure is a different thing from Biodiversity Net Gain. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about BNG and got your heads into that. But Biodiversity Net Gain is fundamentally about habitats, and its real focus is on ecologically defined habitats. Green infrastructure is broader. It is more about people. And I would suggest it's crucially important for many of us in the room. It embraces people's benefits from the use of and proximity to natural living elements, so that it interweaves through our lives too and brings alive those spaces in our built environments. For example, this picture here, Sheffield's the Greater Green, the last bit that was built out. There's another bit on its way, I think. This is the Pollen Market. So it's not just, not only do you enjoy going along it, but events happen, and it's a major place attractor. And also, as noted above, green infrastructure enlists natural functions to help solve built environmental problems. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to be treated to presentations about green infrastructure in both Building with Nature and in the Green Infrastructure Framework of Natural England. First, we have Dr. Gemma Jerome, Director of Building with Nature, which is a national benchmark and accreditation system for green infrastructure, specialising in the design, delivery, management and maintenance of development that puts nature at the heart of its decision-making. She recently co-chaired the British Standards Institute panel for the BS 8683 Biodiversity Net Gain standard and acted in an advisory capacity for the Natural England Green Infrastructure Framework. Gemma became a Fellow of the Landscape Institute in 2021 in recognition of her services to industry and acting as a bold and fresh voice for nature in the planning and development sector. Welcome, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was a really brilliant introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. I'm really pleased to be here and to be part of this session. My camera's looking a bit slow. I'm hoping you can, the sound quality is good and everybody can hear me okay. So I'm going to be looking for the next half an hour at the essential ingredients. Thank you for the thumbs up, everyone. That's really helpful. The essential ingredients of high quality green infrastructure and offering insight from the last 8 years at Building with Nature. In the poll at the beginning, I saw, well, the last time I looked at it, nobody had put themselves in category number 5, which is the expert. We are experts on green infrastructure. We focused on creating new strong standards for green infrastructure. We've been working close with Natural England, really looking forward to hearing from Jane and Martin in a little while. But just now we're going to focus on what we've been doing to really define high quality green infrastructure from the point of view of both development and policy. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first thing I wanted to say is that green infrastructure is critical infrastructure. It's vital that we think of it that way. It has been, as Lee said in her introduction, for too long seen as a nice to have. It's seen as an additional to what actually secures the viability of a development. And actually, we now know through the work of everybody who's presenting today and many other bodies that actually we're talking here about critical infrastructure to secure the longevity of humans and more than humans and the quality of life that we all deserve. So when we're talking about green infrastructure, we're talking about a network of multifunctional green space and other green features, both urban and rural, which can deliver quality of life and environmental benefits if delivered in a high quality way. So my session is about that focus on quality. Next slide, please. When we're thinking about the components that make up green infrastructure, there's a whole typology of green infrastructure features which are critical to actually securing the benefits to people, to wildlife, and to sustainable water management. So it is everything from parks, open spaces, allotments, but it includes private gardens, which is a big shift from the traditional definition of green and open space. It also includes street trees and those green features in the public realm. It includes existing habitat, woodland, and other habitats that have a value, and we need to be protecting, restoring and enhancing those features. It includes soil, so it's everything above the ground and below the ground, and it's also those integral features such as green roofs and green walls, bee bricks, bird and bat boxes. It's also blue features. So you'll hear me talk about green infrastructure today, and there is progressively people are talking about green and blue infrastructure, but when I talk about green infrastructure, please hear that I mean blue infrastructure as well. So yes, it includes rivers, streams, ponds and sustainable drainage systems and those associated features like swales, rain gardens, and sometimes the civil engineering components like permeable paving. So it's the whole gamut of features which are delivering nature-based solutions and those services, those ecological and ecosystem services to people, to wildlife. That's what we're focused on completely holistically when we are talking about high quality green infrastructure. Next slide, please. So Building with Nature have created a standards framework for green infrastructure, and we have 12 quality standards which are focused on the how. How do we deliver green infrastructure so it delivers those benefits? We have a set of core standards, and that is really about distinguishing green infrastructure from a more conventional approach to the design and delivery of green and open space. And we'll come on to look at the principles behind those. Well-being is about focusing on making sure green infrastructure is close to where people are, so we can really deliver those benefits for people. Water is about ensuring green infrastructure is integral to our approach to water management, and to really secure those benefits from sustainable water management, whether that's at a site scale or whether it's at a catchment scale. And the wildlife focus is about ensuring we get those biodiversity gains, but they are climate resilient and can be secured in perpetuity. And we're also interested in connectivity at that landscape scale as well. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through the core principles that sit behind our core standards now, and I'm just going to move through these. So what we say when we talk about high quality green infrastructure from that perspective of how do we deliver this, then the green infrastructure needs to be multifunctional, ensuring that individual features in combination contribute to a network of multiple benefits. This is one of the key things that distinguishes green infrastructure from green and open space, that each and every component, wherever possible, is optimized to deliver more than one function, not maximized, because we don't actually want to end up in a situation where the one piece of land is trying to do too many things and doesn't do any of them very well, but we optimize the multifunctionality where we can. Next slide. And that in combination, the green infrastructure is connected. So we need to provide or fill in missing natural links. So this is about restoring networks. This is about going back to the Lawton principles. We need to create more, bigger, better, and more connected nature to actually secure the benefits that it delivers to us and ensure that we actually reverse biodiversity collapse. So that connectivity is not only important from a people and movement point of view, but also from a nature point of view. So that connected principle is very important. Next slide, please. We want the green infrastructure to be resilient. So we talk in Building with Nature about actually ensuring that the green infrastructure responds to the climate emergency in a positive and contributory way. So that may be about identifying the risks and hazards related with the development, and then asking yourself the question, how can green infrastructure support the climate resilience of this site? What are the ambitions at a local plan level for climate, that where this development sits, and how can this particular site contribute positively to those wider ambitions? How do we make good on that climate emergency? And we believe that green infrastructure has a vital, critical role to play in that, and ensuring that we do that at a site scale, but then how we respond at site scale actually contributes to that wider scale as well, to meet those district level objectives. Next, please. Thank you. And we also want the green infrastructure to be sympathetically placed. So thinking about how does that green infrastructure actually reflect or create a sense of place? Are we considering the context and character of the local environment and the priorities of the people and wildlife that actually are going to benefit from that particular site, from that particular location? And recognizing we don't want to create green infrastructure that is just following some kind of replicable standard where it doesn't have a clear and measurable link back to what's important, what's a priority from a biodiversity or from a social point of view for that particular location. Next slide, please. We need the green infrastructure to be responsibly managed, so ensuring that we've got a sustainable mechanism to support its lifelong functions and benefits. This is in the round. So yes, we now have that 30-year monitoring period for biodiversity net gain land that is delivering against those biodiversity units, but we need this for all green infrastructure, and we need to think about the most sustainable, proportionate and commensurate approach to stewardship for that particular site. It's about the model, it's about the governance, it's about about the mechanism, the resources, and it may involve community volunteering as well. But we believe we can look at that from the point of view of that site and that project and that budget and those stakeholders, and that's how we get the most sustainable solution. So we don't have a prescriptive approach, but we do have good examples and good industry practice that we can draw from. And we also have case studies. I know that's a big stewardship is a big question around green infrastructure, so I just wanted to touch on that a little bit now. Next slide, please. We want the green infrastructure to also be thinking about environmental net gains. So we need to be thinking about mitigating the local impact of development, because every development is going to have an environmental impact. So it's the unavoidable environmental impacts that we need to mitigate for. And how can green infrastructure help with that? So how can we introduce green infrastructure or protect and retain existing green infrastructure and enhance to actually ensure that we are mitigating any unavoidable harmful impacts? And that might be on the soil, it might be on water features within the proximity of the development. It might also be about minimizing light and noise pollution, and also creating quiet places for people and wildlife. Next slide, please. So as a summary, the core holistic design principles, we're looking for multifunctional, connected, sympathetically placed, resilient, responsibly managed, and environmentally sensitive. Thank you. Next slide. We're now going to move on to the first thematic area of the Building with Nature Standards framework, which focuses on well-being. So we've got the 3 Ws: well-being, water, and wildlife. So I'm going to touch on well-being first. Well-being, the well-being standards are focused on how do we deliver green infrastructure that is close to where people live, so they can really get the benefit. So where people are, where they live, where they work, learn and play, and also thinking about access in the most holistic sense. So it may be physical access, so we absolutely need to remove any barriers, either actual or perceived barriers to access, but it also is thinking about the benefits of visual and auditory access. So not everybody can use and enjoy green infrastructure the same way. So those visual and auditory access points also have huge benefits for people. Next slide, please. The next part of the well-being standards is inclusivity. So how do we ensure that local people are invited to and are able to engage with green infrastructure? And is that green infrastructure sympathetic to, reflecting back both their needs but also their strengths? We believe really strongly at Build with Nature that every community has strengths, and we quite often in planning terms look at the deficits and how do we meet those needs and prioritize, and that's completely valid. But we also need to think, and this is why we have statutory processes around community engagement, of course, we need to think about the community strengths. And it might be a case of we don't always know what areas of green infrastructure are important to local people and why. So in terms of bringing forward high quality green infrastructure, we need that holistic approach to ensure that what we create is as inclusive as it possibly can be, and also over time as well, because communities change, both their needs and strengths will change over time. Next slide, please. Thinking about seasonality, this is another aspect of access and inclusivity. Green infrastructure changes over the year, and so what we want to do and how we want to benefit and enjoy that green infrastructure will also change over that year and through the season. So if there are hard features and soft features we can introduce, whether that's seating, whether that's lighting, whether that's about access routes, pathways, gateways, whether it's about the landscape, the actual planting schedule, and the aesthetics and the scents and the colour of landscape, we need to be thinking about seasonality, and that is also a characteristic of high quality. Next slide, please. We need to think about the health and well-being outcomes. It was really pertinent to me that in Lee's introduction, she talked about the mental health crisis, especially of children and young people. I was just in Essex last week, and in Colchester, they've got the 3rd highest suicide rate for young people. It's not good enough. We need to be supporting our communities as absolute best we can. And the centre I was visiting, there were 3 mornings a week, interactive activity sessions with those young people at risk in the garden, and it was kind of survey in, survey out, one of the most popular ways in which young people were getting support and benefit from that particular health service. So we know that green infrastructure is critical to both physical health and psychological and mental health. So if we are thinking about health inequalities and how people are excluded, having accessible and public and open access to green infrastructure is really important in our communities. Next slide, please. Thinking about the social aspect of green infrastructure, how do we create a sense of social cohesion and sustainability? How do we introduce or retain features in our environments where people can gather? So it might be about different size of spaces, it might be about different types of spaces. How do we remove, again, any barriers, perceived barriers or actual barriers around safety? How are different groups? We had that report, a fantastic report just in the past month about women and girls, and how do we ensure that they feel safe and want to use and enjoy green infrastructure? So always thinking about those barriers to use and enjoyment. Next slide, please. We also need to think from a well-being point of view that people will feel most at the highest sense of belonging if there is a sense of place. So if we're going back to that idea of stewardship, as well as just if we're thinking about not just where people are homeowners, but where people are renting and also in social housing, one of the most kind of biggest demands on resource can be people moving. So if we're thinking about retention and people feeling settled and people feeling safe and people feeling part of a community, there are lots of reasons why we'll have turnover, but one of the key drivers of retention can be a sense of belonging and also a sense of pride about where people live. And that might be because they're actively engaged in the stewardship. It might just be because they enjoy and understand why their environment looks the way it looks. So recognizing that from a well-being point of view, we can also think about place distinctiveness, and that's one of the key characteristics of high quality green infrastructure too. Great slide here showing a Cornish hedge. So we can combine again that multifunctionality. Sorry, it's a habitat, and it's also part of that soft boundary of a footprint of a development. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. So in summary, we need to think about accessibility and inclusivity, thinking about seasonality. How does green infrastructure support the reduction of health and social inequalities, and how does it support a distinct sense of place? Okay, we're going to move through to the water standards now. So thinking about the principles behind our water standards, that the green infrastructure is integrated. Now, this is, in simple terms, we need to move forward. We've got Schedule 3 now. There is ample legislative drivers for sustainable drainage systems to be at the front of our thinking about how we manage water in the landscape through a development context. And we're just here to support you in terms of your specification drivers, and on the developer side to support those stakeholders with understanding how and removing those barriers, whether they're perceived or actual. We've done some great work recently with the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport, and we've just published a green and blue infrastructure manual, and we're now working to look at how we integrate SUDs into highways, because there may well be a whole range of local government specialists here, and this is a key focus when it comes to high quality green infrastructure. Is the green infrastructure integrated into the approach to water management? Not an afterthought, not a nice to have or an add-on, but actually an integral approach to the engineering of how we manage water. Next slide, please. Thinking also that in terms of the Syria SUDS manual and those 4 pillars, quantity, quality, amenity and biodiversity, what we do at Builder Nature is we look to the industry good practice and we build those into our approach. We're not repeating, we're actually coalescing and creating a one-stop shop to understand what good looks like. So when it comes to quantity and quality, we know that the sustainable drainage system approach to managing water can support the management of quantity of water, so volumes and flows of water, and actually managing that as close to the site as possible, as close to where the water falls as possible, and also then slowing the flow and having different management train features that it runs through is impacting positively on the quality. So we're talking here about flood and pollution risk as a main driver for why we need to be integrating SUDs. Next slide, please. That the green infrastructure is also catchment connected. So there are many drivers for this. The local lead flood authority is very clear that we need to think not just at the site level, but at the catchment scale. So the message here is that green infrastructure can help with that too. So water storage, capacity of land adjacent to or downstream from the site is actually enhanced because we're managing the water on site as effectively as possible. So you can see an image here from a Builder Nature award-winning scheme in Scotland. It's a hospital. hospital, and this is the road leading into the hospital. So the main highway in, it has swales, and it happened to be raining on the day we did a site visit, and you can see the water clearly being managed there, slowing that flow, running off from the road, and that's part of a wider sustainable drainage system that actually has a lake at the end of that train, then providing brilliant amenity and biodiversity benefits too. Next slide, please. The green infrastructure water features, again, for bringing through that theme of multifunctionality, the features themselves. We want to move away from this approach where we're managing water with these features, we're bringing amenity benefits with these features, and then we're actually delivering biodiversity gains over here with these features. Where possible, bringing those design drivers together and designing in different functionality for different benefits, whether they're required benefits or whether they're desirable benefits, into the same features. So water, rather than just seeing it as a risk to manage, actually it can be a benefit depending on the site, depending on the context. Having standing, flowing or ephemeral features where seasonally it may be dry, it may be wet, is really giving that additional driver for place distinctiveness and amenity and habitat benefit too. Next slide, please. And it can be nature-based. So again, thinking about nature-based solutions as your approach to water management wherever possible. So in summary, we want the green infrastructure to be an integral approach to sustainable water management, thinking about quantity and quality, thinking about the impact on the catchment, where possible, thinking about nature-based solutions. So the multifunctionality of individual features, the resilience of the whole management train. So rather than one big feature that manages water and then everything kind of flowing into that, we often see a detention basin. A very kind of standard approach to development is a detention basin at the entrance, and then the network of roads will be feeding through pipes or directly into that. If we break that management train up and we have smaller features, we actually accelerate the possibility that there'll be amenity and biodiversity benefit. It also makes the system more resilient as a whole, because if one feature fails, we don't have a situation where we're back to flood risk. Okay, we're going to move through to the wildlife standards as the final set of principles. So thinking about wildlife in terms of what can green infrastructure do to support wildlife. The wildlife standards are all about responding positively to the biodiversity emergency. So we're thinking about the fact that, yes, we have legislative drivers now around biodiversity net gain, but as Lee said in her introduction, the broad typology of green infrastructure features, aside from those that are just delivering biodiversity net gains, which may be on-site, may be off-site, we can't afford to relax our focus away from ensuring that network of green infrastructure features is delivering biodiversity benefits, and that those benefits are also resilient to changes in climate, and that they also have appropriate management and maintenance. So thinking about that the green infrastructure is cognizant of the location of the site within that wider network, nature recovery we're talking about here. So that particular development site, where does it sit in that wider nature recovery network? Many local authorities are starting to define through their local nature recovery strategies. So we're in a very interesting place, how we actually start to define the potential of individual sites to contribute nature recovery, to be a stepping stone, both for existing habitat, but planned for actually bridging those gaps. So that's what we're talking about here, that actually the green infrastructure approach through the development and planning process can be one of the main drivers to actually responding to that biodiversity crisis and the need for nature recovery. Next slide, please. We also want that green infrastructure to be integral to the placemaking approach. So we can't afford to have two parallel tracks running where some people are focused on ensuring that we get 10% biodiversity net gain as a very key specification driver for development, and then others are involved in making a great place for people to live. We need those two things to be integral. So we want the wildlife and habitat to be fundamentally integral to the built environment, that we're then optimizing the opportunities to have nature connection, because as Lee said, green infrastructure is as focused on people as it is on nature and ecology. It's this it's this integral approach that we're interested in, this holistic approach of how is the green infrastructure creating a sense of place, creating high quality landscape, contributing to the creation or enhancement of high quality habitat too. Next slide, please. Protecting and enhancing. The green infrastructure absolutely needs to protect and enhance our existing nature areas as well. So this really, at this principle, is reinforcing the mitigation hierarchy. We can't afford to lose any of our high quality priority habitat areas that are already vital to nature's recovery. So where we can, we want to support the development and planning process to understand that, well, we're going to hear from Martin later about mapping. So mapping our existing assets and ensuring that when we're allocating land for development, that's completely cognizant of where our existing assets are. But again, that key word I said earlier, the planned for assets as well, because those who are skilled and knowledgeable about ecology will be able to identify where the key sites are within that wider nature recovery network, where we should be creating those linkages and creating new habitat, which then creates a much more resilient network. So our approach to green infrastructure is to ensure that the starting point is to protect and retain any existing assets, and then overlay a green infrastructure approach to that. So it sounds like maybe an obvious point to make, but we still too often see removal or kind of damage to existing assets, and then trying to offset or mitigate that by delivering high quality green infrastructure. And it's not one or the other, it needs to be both. That's the point of this principle. Next slide, please. There's also this opportunity for creation of new habitat to be transformative, to create high quality place, to create those opportunities for placemaking can also be one of the drivers of how we bring habitat rich areas forward. So thinking about the long-term management plans and the sustainability of those plans, we need to be thinking about the management of habitat at the design stage to ensure that how something is drawn up is actually going to be how it's experienced and delivered, and we actually can secure the delivery for wildlife in the way that was intended at the point of planning approval. Next slide, please. Making sure ultimately that we're reversing the long-term decline in biodiversity and aiding nature recovery. Next slide, please. Okay, so in summary, we need, from a wildlife point of view, we need the green infrastructure to be cognizant of the network, the nature recovery network, and where individual sites sit within that and how they can contribute positively to nature recovery. We need the green infrastructure to be integral to the site, so ensuring that we protect and enhance wherever possible within the red line boundary of a development, and as is the case with the natural England approach, as a last resort, we're delivering outside of that red line boundary. This is from a development and planning point of view, bringing forward new development, that we're protecting and enhancing what we have, that we're seeing this as an opportunity to be transformative, and that our sites become more and more nature rich. Thank you. Next slide. So just the final couple of slides from me is to say that we have the Building with Nature Standards framework, which has all of these principles integrated, the actual wording of our standards, which define high quality green infrastructure at each stage of the planning and development process. And we also have other resources available. So you can download the standards framework, you can download this PDF case study resources. We'd love to show you how we've been working with people to secure high quality green infrastructure, because we've been working with local authorities directly, we've been working with developers directly, we've been working in partnership with developers and local authorities on some projects too, because that dialogue, that positive dialogue, trying to get away from arbitrary kind of horse trading around affordable housing, green infrastructure, we believe that it is possible to deliver a viable and high quality scheme, whether it's residential led or whether it's mixed use. We've got examples across the UK of developments which have secured these principles. And also we've got examples of policy as well. So if you move on to the next slide, please. There is the opportunity to work in a more formal capacity with Building Nature. We want people to use our knowledge, and it's open source to do that, but we also recognize that some developments might benefit from an external verification. So it might be about a wider set of stakeholders who want that verification. So potentially elected members, potentially community members, potentially actually the developer themselves is looking to tell the story of why their development is good. From a local authority point of view, we have the policy award to also allow that support from Building Nature to integrate our standards and the principles of high quality green infrastructure into potentially a local plan or a sustainable planning document for a particular development. We're working with garden communities in that way because it's such a long process. We want to actually make sure we've really clearly defined from the outset what those design parameters are that we're looking for. So the Building Nature Awards are that extra level, if people want to go that extra level, to really secure that external verification of quality. And the awards reflects the stage at which you might want to apply them. So at outline, the design award is most applicable, and then we have the full award, which includes a post-construction check, because as we know time and time again, it's actually what happens post-approval at the construction and long-term management and maintenance stage where things might slip in terms of quality, functionality. So we wanted to include that in our approach. So that's the end of my presentation. That's the end of my 30 minutes. And I know we've got a lot to get through, so I'm really looking forward to the next presentation, which I'm going to introduce. So I'm really delighted to be handing over to Jane Horton. I've been working with Jane for the past couple of years, and it's fantastic what her and her team have been doing at Natural England. So Jane works in Natural England, project managing the development of the Green Infrastructure Framework, the principles and standards for England. Jane also represents Natural England on the Essex Local Nature Partnership Board and the British Standards Institute Sustainability Standards Network. Jane was formerly a project officer for the Thames Gateway Greening the Gateway Partnership, and prior to joining Natural England, Jane managed local authority country parks and woodlands in London, Essex. So from some fantastic real life knowledge on the ground, I mean to say. She has also worked at Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and in community enterprises in the South Pacific and Australia. Throughout her career, Jane has worked in the natural environment to enhance urban and urban fringe areas for people and nature. I couldn't think of anyone better to be leading this project, Jane. Over to you.
That's very kind of you, Gemma. Thank you very much. And many thanks for inviting us today. I'm really pleased to join you to talk through the new Green Infrastructure Framework of Principles and Standards for England and how it can be used to help create and maintain high quality places. Next slide, please. So the Green Infrastructure Framework is a commitment in the government's 25-year environment plan, and its development was overseen by a cross-government steering group. We engaged 70 different advisory group members throughout the development, and we tested it with local authorities and developers. We launched the framework in January this year to an online audience of over 3,500, so it was the largest Natural England webinar to date. And the key aims of the Green Infrastructure Framework are to really improve existing and create more good quality green infrastructure for all its benefits, and to ensure everyone has access to good quality green infrastructure, particularly where provision is poorest and in areas of low income and health inequalities. And we want to support local authorities in refreshing their local plans and mainstream green infrastructure as a key asset in creating and maintaining sustainable places. So we'll also be monitoring and evaluating the impact of the GI framework, and this evaluation is a commitment in the government's environmental improvement plan. Next slide, please. So the framework contains 15 principles of good green infrastructure, a GI mapping database, which last year won a Government Geography Award, and Martin will talk more about that later, 5 headline green infrastructure standards, a green infrastructure planning and design guide, and process journeys, so step-by-step guides on applying the GI framework. Essentially, we have a greening toolbox, and I'll talk through each component. Next slide, please. So, firstly, the green infrastructure principles which underpin the GI framework set out the why, what, and how of good GI. And there are 15 of these. Firstly, 5 why principles in blue in the centre, and these explain why we do good GI in terms of the benefits and the outcomes. So places that are nature rich and beautiful, active and healthy, thriving and prospering, climate resilient, and that have improved water management. And then there are the 5 descriptive principles in the orange circles, describing what good GI looks like. So multifunctional, varied, connected, accessible, and responding to local character. And then 5 how or process principles in green. So partnership and vision, evidence, planning strategically, good design, and well managed, valued, and evaluated. And full information about the principles are on our GI website. But you'll notice that the Natural England GI principle and the current set of Building with Nature standards mirror each other closely, and they were developed alongside each other, and both have been informed by academic literature, evidence reviews, and they've been tested by local authorities and industry. Next slide, please. So this slide introduces the 5 headline green infrastructure standards. They're voluntary standards and they support the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF. They're referred to in the National Model Design Code. And they'll also complement mandatory mechanisms such as Biodiversity Net Gain and local nature recovery strategies, which form part of the Environment Act. These 5 headline standards include a green infrastructure strategy standard, and then standards for accessible green space, urban nature recovery, urban greening, and urban tree canopy cover. And each of the standards distinguish between recommended levels of achievement when they're applied at an area-wide scale, and then recommended levels of achievement for major new developments, and that's using the NPPF definition. Next slide, please. So, firstly, the Green Infrastructure Strategy Standard supports the NPPF's policy that local authorities should develop strategic policies for green infrastructure. And this standard says that at an area-wide scale, local authorities in partnership with local communities should produce both a green infrastructure strategy or its equivalent and a delivery plan that apply the GI principles and standards locally. So these strategies and plans set out how GI will help to create greener, beautiful, healthier and more prosperous neighbourhoods with a thriving nature network that can reduce air and water pollution and support sustainable drainage and help places to adapt to climate change. And developers should also produce a green infrastructure plan for their major developments. And this is because producing a GI strategy is a rallying point that allows you to look at where you are, where you're going, and how you're going to get there. And it can really help to turn policies into practical action on the ground. Next slide, please. So going on to headline standard 2, the accessible green space standards. When we use the term green space, it also includes blue space, and the same with green infrastructure. It's green and blue infrastructure. We've updated English Nature's original accessible natural green space standards, or ANGST, to create these new accessible green space standards. And a key commitment linked to them is that everyone should live within 15 minutes walk of a green or blue space. And this commitment is made in the cross-government environmental improvement plan. And it was made alongside a commitment to also work to reduce barriers which prevent people from accessing green and blue spaces, such as physical challenges, lack of confidence and lack of information. DEFRA is leading on this commitment with support from Natural England and a wider cross-departmental working group which Homes England also sit on. And the next meeting is on the 18th of July, but more information will be available on this in due course. So going back to the standards also include a capacity standard that there should be at least 3 hectares of publicly accessible green space per 1,000 population. And in terms of quality, accessible green spaces should meet the Green Flag Award criteria and be inclusive and accessible for all so that everyone can benefit. And for major developments, the local authority specifies the accessible green space to be provided within or associated with the development. Next slide, please. So this is the full set of new accessible green space standards for size and proximity, and they're supported by our evidence review findings that we need a range of sizes and types of GI to meet people's needs and maximise the health and wellbeing benefits. We've added 2 new size and distance criteria to the original angst. Firstly, doorstep green space, a minimum size of 0.5 hectares within 200 metres. And this is an alternative to the local green space criterion, which is 2 hectares within 300 metres, and it responds to feedback that a smaller size is needed to fit green spaces into dense urban areas, but also the finding during COVID that green space close to home is really important for people without access to private gardens. And the new neighbourhood green space criterion of 10 hectares within 1 kilometre aims to encourage people to walk to visit green spaces for the health benefits, but also to reduce car use, improve air quality and mitigate climate change. Next slide, please. So next, the Urban Nature Recovery Standard, and this says that local areas should increase the proportion of urban and urban fringe green infrastructure that's designed and managed for nature recovery, but also increase the number and quality of local nature reserves and local wildlife sites. And for major developments, the developer identifies its contribution to nature recovery and includes this in their GI plan. And this standard can be used to really focus on the contribution of an urban area to the national nature recovery network and local nature recovery strategies. Next slide, please. Fourthly, the Urban Greening Factor Standard aims to increase the level of greening in developments and in urban environments more widely, and aims to improve their resilience, sustainability and biodiversity. So here, by urban greening, we mean the vegetation ground cover, including trees, soils and water, and also green roofs and walls, all as opposed to sealed man-made surfaces. And this standard says there should be at least 40% average green cover in urban residential neighbourhoods and no net loss of green cover in urban neighbourhoods generally. For major developments, we've developed a new national urban greening factor, which is a new type of planning tool. Next slide, please. So the urban greening factor works by local planning authorities adopting local plan policies that set green infrastructure target scores for the quantity and quality of GI in developments using the urban greening factor approach and calculations. So different target scores are recommended for predominantly commercial or residential development. The highest scores are recommended for residential greenfield sites. In this, the quality of GI is assessed according to the different surface cover types in the development in the 4 groups shown here. And each surface cover type is given a weighting called a factor. And this is according to its value for both nature and the range of ecosystem services it can deliver. So there's a minimum weighting of 0 for sealed man-made surface and a maximum of 1 for semi-natural habitat. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a worked example of how the urban greening factor is calculated for a theoretical development site. And basically, you multiply the area of each surface cover type by its weighting, add all the figures together and divide by the total area of within the site boundary. And you can then compare the result, in this case 0.46, with the target urban greening factor score for the development site, which has been set by the local plan policy. And this indicates whether the urban greening proposals achieve, exceed or fail to meet the defined target. And councils that have adopted a UGF, such as Southampton and City of London, have fed back that a key strength of the tool is facilitating early discussions and negotiations on the quantity and quality of GIF investment during the pre-application stage of development. And a viability study for the London plan assessed the potential costs associated with the new UGF, and they concluded that any cost impact was marginal. Next slide, please. So finally, the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard, which we developed with the Forestry Commission, and this promotes an increase in tree cover for the many benefits that trees can provide in towns and cities. And at an area-wide level, local authorities should measure their baseline tree canopy cover and then set a target to increase it by an agreed percentage. And this responds to the very wide variability in tree canopy cover in different places. We're offering a free training webinar on this standard on Thursday this week, and further details are on our GI Framework website. Local authorities who've undertaken exercises such as this have found that it can lead to an increase in local authority tree maintenance budgets, as demonstrated in Torbay. Next slide, please. So that was the standards. Moving on to the Green Infrastructure Planning and Design Guide. This supports local authorities in developing design codes for green infrastructure, and it works with the National Model Design Code. And it complements the National Design Guide. It shows how GI can be designed to help deliver the National Design Guide's 10 characteristics of a well-designed place. And it provides practical advice on the building blocks of GI and on designing GI in different types of areas. And we've written it for local authority planners, but it's also useful for landscape architects, urban designers, green space managers, and wider stakeholders. Next slide, please. Finally, the process journeys, and these are step-by-step best practice guides on how different stakeholder groups can take a strategic approach to GI. And there's one for local planning authorities to develop GI strategies and policies, one for developers and design teams, and one for neighbourhood planning groups. And you'll see that there's a poll that we can now show you in order to ask you about whether or not you have an up-to-date green infrastructure strategy within the last 5 years in your area. We're really interested in asking this question to help us plan our natural England resources to support local authorities in their GI, and it'll help to shape our training packages. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Looking at the results, I can see that about 13–14% have a GI strategy completed in the last 5 years, and a further 14% or so are developing a GI strategy currently. Others, 7%, have a GI strategy more than 5 years old, and 7% interested in developing a GI strategy. Thank you very much. We'll take that away, and that will help us to shape, as I said, our training packages. Many thanks. And moving on to the next slide, I wanted to just say very briefly something about Biodiversity Net Gain, which we know will set a minimum requirement for 10% net gain for biodiversity relating to new development. And there's a strong linkage between biodiversity net gain and GI. So the biodiversity metric that's used to calculate BNG includes many common green infrastructure habitat features. So GI can help to meet BNG requirements. And the GI framework can help to enhance the functionality of habitat, as Gemma was saying, delivered as a requirement of BNG. Where appropriate, GI can help to ensure that nature delivers wider benefits for people and biodiversity. And some green space managers can provide biodiversity units if they can create and enhance habitat on the land and meet the criteria, so gaining income. And the urban greening factor can work really well alongside biodiversity net gain, especially where there's no or very limited pre-existing biodiversity value on a site. Next slide, please. And similarly, you'll be aware that local nature recovery strategies are new locally led mandatory spatial strategies for nature and environmental improvement required by the Environment Act. And they're tools to help establish the National Nature Recovery Network and can support biodiversity net gain and the strengthened duty to conserve and enhance biodiversity. And LNRS will draw on other spatial plans and strategies such as GI strategies. So it's going to be important that GI can help inform LNRS and vice versa. And while the focus of LNRS is nature recovery, wider benefits can be included where appropriate. So just to finish on next steps, we're looking forward over the next year to offering advice on the GI framework through our area teams across England, developing user guides for the standards and providing online training. We'll undertake a baseline survey for the future evaluation of the GI framework, and we'll be seeking feedback on the headline standards from stakeholders. And Natural England and Building with Nature are really keen to develop a better understanding as to whether some or all of the NE standards can be achieved through Building with Nature accreditation, both for policy making and developments. And we're interested in working with stakeholders who would like to test this by jointly applying the Natural England GI standards and pursuing formal accreditation with Building with Nature. So we'll provide more information about this through our website in the next few months. Next slide, please. Many thanks for listening. There's a link here on to our Green Infrastructure Framework website, and I'm now going to hand you over to Martin Moss from Natural England. Martin is Senior Advisor Green Infrastructure and maintains and develops the Natural England Green Infrastructure Mapping Database to support delivery of the Green Infrastructure Standards Framework. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jane. And if we can move straight to the next slide, please. Well, thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, everyone. And I have about 15 minutes to achieve the impossible, which is to go through the England Green Infrastructure Mapping Database, which is as big a mouthful as it is a set of maps and data. So this necessarily is going to be a very quick, very high level sort of overview, partly of purpose. I'll mention some of the content we've currently got and plans for the future. So on that basis, we will talk a little bit about version 1.2, which is the version out there, and I'll mention quite a lot about some of the content which is developing and will emerge as version 2.1 in the future. Can we go to the next slide, please? And before I do, I'll just mention my primary sponsors, without whom none of this work would have happened. So the mapping sits within the framework of standards for England, Green Infrastructure Standards for England, but is also part of the Natural Capital and Ecosystems Assessment Programme, which is a very large cross-DEFRA programme, which is aimed at improving the evidence we have about England's ecosystems, and the urban ecosystem in particular is one of them, perhaps least represented in terms of broad evidence terms, but we're trying to do something about that. So the programme is working with me, or I'm working with the programme, to develop the evidence that goes into the mapping, and then the mapping itself is about how the standards itself are taken out of a sort of evidence environment and into a delivery one. So next slide, please. So in terms of the objectives for the mapping, overall, there are 4 things that we're trying to do with it. The first one is to provide a publicly accessible open data green infrastructure mapping source at an England scale. And that's for the first time. One of the issues with GI mapping over time, there's some great stuff out there, but it's usually at a fairly local level and isn't necessarily very easy to add up across England. So this will be publicly accessible, but it's not publicly facing. It's not all that friendly. It's hellishly technical, but you can actually access both the website which depicts the mapping and the data itself if you can operate it in a GIS environment. It provides common access to data across all England so that no area has less evidence about green infrastructure than is currently in the England database. Some areas have much bigger, much better, perhaps, certainly more detailed evidence. Other places do not. This is the common baseline for all. And it provides that evidence to support a range of national to local planning, strategy and targeting needs at multiple scales. It works best at an England level. It works reasonably well for most local authorities. It provides data increasingly locally to MSOA, to LSOA level, but I am always at pains to emphasize that the nature of this exercise is a national mapping exercise and it uses national data. And the closer you get to the ground, the more you will need to ground truth it. It gets you there, maybe 50%, maybe 60%, maybe 70%, depending on where you are, but you've got to meet it, that 30, 40 or 50%, to turn it into a product you can really use at a local level. That's why we provide the data under open government license terms and conditions. It's in a GIS environment, I'm afraid, but you can supplement that data with local data to turn it into something which is going to meet your local mapping requirements. Next slide, please. And it's all about understanding change. This is the big agenda, really. We know that green infrastructure is not static. It does change over time. The mapping's part of our ability, or developing ability, to understand that change typologically, to look at the change in terms of locations, distributions, but crucially the impact that has on people, and to understand that change in 2 particular contexts, one of which is a socio-environmental context. This is an infrastructure. It's there to do a job. It might be composed of bits and pieces of natural stuff, but it's there to do a job. Is it doing that job in the right place at the right time for the right people? Yes, not. If not, what do we do about that? And then also, and increasingly, going back to the NCEA really, we want to understand change in the underpinning ecosystem in terms of habitat compensation, naturalness as a proxy for quality, and increasingly in the future, species diversity as well. There's a lot of work going on here, but there's a lot to do into the future as well. But it's all based on the premise that a healthy green infrastructure requires a healthy urban ecosystem to work properly. And we are focused in terms of this particular outcome on the urban environment. It is perhaps, you know, I might be wrong here, but I tend to think of it as it is the ecosystem that most of us live in. 80% of us live in the 20% of the land which could be called urban, but it's possibly the one about which we know the least. So next slide, please. And version progression is very important here. I'm trying to get into what I call the 5-year stride. So this isn't a static map. There you go. It was wonderful. Have a nice day. This is something which will change over time, and there will be progressive versions in order to allow us to do that change detection. What's happening where? Version 1.1 published back in December 21. Warts and all, I might say. Version 1.2 was the first upgrade back in January of this year, where we've improved quite a lot of stuff and added some new content. Version 1, those two things together, is now locked down. So we've done version 1. That's the beginning of the first 5-year stride. And we will use version 1 in the future to do change detection against the following version, version 2. Work on version 2. Well, we're up to our next in version 2 at the moment. And I've got here it's due for publication in December 23. In me dreams, that won't happen. We're about at least 3 months behind. So probably more like March or April next year. But in March 2025, version 2 itself will be locked down, and we will begin the first quintennial 5-yearly change detection exercise to see what's changed between version 2 and version 1. And at the same time, we will start version 3, which will be due for change detection in 2030. Next slide, please. And in terms of the structure, it is developing, it's emerging. It's been emerging over the last few years or so, but the information that we are now developing will be structured increasingly around the 4 key headline spatial standards of accessible green space, urban nature recovery, urban greening, and urban tree canopy. Next slide, please. This is the content of version 1.2. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all that. There are 13 different modules, and the further down the list, those at the bottom there are still very much developmental. We've got some data, but not enough. But the key thing to understand here is that some of the modules, such as the green and blue infrastructure assets, the public rights of way, some of the blue infrastructure, and some of the things like the socioeconomic statistics, so what we call core data. So we create the core data out of a whole series of different external source data into one sub-data set, if you like, which we then use to extract information from and combine it with some other data to create what we call derived products. So much of the mapping content is various different derived products. And if you're really interested in what's in there and how it works, then there is going to be a link to the deep dive that we did a few months ago, which is an hour and a half long as a recorded GI web portal recording in the resources training page, where if there's absolutely nothing on the telly and you've got an hour and a half to spend, you can go through module by module what's actually in there. I'm not going to do that today. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So as an example, this is what we call map 1. This is the green and blue infrastructure assets maps. So do we include blue? Oh, yes, we do. In fact, there's a huge amount of blue infrastructure data in the existing mapping, and there's more on the way. So this is where we brought together, I think, several data sets that spatially describe different sorts of assets out there in the landscape, as it will extract information from that data set or that database in real terms to fuel our ability to do other analyses. So a key thing to understand is these aren't maps to help you navigate the world. In fact, if you try to navigate the world with the combined G and BI map, you're going to get hellishly confused. It's a complicated product. It is a database in its own right. It's there to provide us with evidence. Next slide, please. And evidence around what? Well, going back to those 4 key spatial standards, accessible green space is the first one. And much of version 1 itself was actually focused on accessible spaces of one form or another. So we have accessible green infrastructure maps. We did the first England level accessible natural green space assessment, and we've got other data around public rights of way, and we've done various things with it, and a lot of data around access to water side, both an all England and an urban only. I don't have time to go through all those, but we'll just have a quick look on the next slide at the England Accessible Natural Green Space Standards Assessment. The title of this will be changing, but at the moment that's what it's called in the mapping, where we've taken this new system of 6 different standards. We spatially understood where the various different sorts of space sizes are in terms of accessible spaces, and we buffered those with each of these buffers that we see here. And we end up with a map which allows us to know which site is surrounded by what buffer, which area is covered by which different sorts of buffers, and there's what I call the angst profile here. So some places may be doorstep only, or they may be doorstep in a district, or they may have 3 or 4 different buffers which relate to that individual location. And pinned to that, because we've got a spatial understanding where the buffers are, we can estimate the population that is within that buffer. So at a national level, we estimate about 1 in 3 people are in the doorstep buffer, about 1 in 4 in the local, and a little bit under 50% are in the neighbourhood, and so on. So we're starting to get some baselines of where things are, what's covered by what, and who's in there. Next slide, please. When we use these classes spatially, at an LSOA level, we start to be able to classify different LSOAs according to their access inequalities class. What I really want to show here is the difference that happens when you change the parameter to the map. So the top map is where we're looking at green space supply, if you like, and the index of multiple deprivation. And the bottom one is looking at population density. And instantly, those 2 maps are at the same place. So instantly, you get a very different map. If you change a parameter, if you change the threshold, that can have a big impact on the mapping. So if you do get around to messing with the data, remember that, because you can start to get some very different results. Next slide, please. I will just mention public right of way by way of adverts. I haven't got time to go all through this, but you will notice there are some grey blobs on the map at the top right, and some white blobs on the map on the bottom right. And these are gaps in the data. We try to collate all the data we can from every highway authority in England, but we do have gaps. So if going forward you have a look at this public right of way data and you find you are a gap on the map and you've got vector data that you can give to Natural England, please get in contact, because we'd love to talk to you. Next slide, please. But moving on to support for urban nature recovery. This is a long-term project. It is a massive piece of work in its own right, and we've been working on it for about 2 years now. But we have developed an Earth observation-based approach to urban habitat mapping. So first question is, what's in the urban environments? The next question is, well, what's its quality? If you're doing habitat mapping, we normally talk about condition. We can't really do condition of habitats like this, and particularly not in the urban area. So we're looking at a new approach to understanding naturalness as a proxy for the quality of these resources. So if we know what it is, we know what its quality is. What else can we derive? Well, we want to look at, and we're starting to do a little bit of early work to start to build in data information about the species. So what's there, what's this quality, and what's living there ultimately could be the sort of information we need to support urban nature recovery going forward. And we're working with a few pilot cities to work out how that can connect with a variety of different agendas in policy terms out there. Next slide, please. That's what one looks like. It won't look like this when you get your filthy sticky bits on it, because the colour change will all change. But basically, we map the whole area. Everything there is treated as a habitat, even if it is an impervious and non-vegetated surface, and classified according to detailed and broad classes. It's an Earth observation approach with some green infrastructure thinking. It's not traditional. It's still a bit experimental. Some of this we hope will start to emerge with version 2.1. Next slide, please. And we use that data to start to try and understand naturalness, and we want to try and understand naturalness both at a city scale, but also on an individual accessible green infrastructure polygon scale. So we can look at how we might change the naturalness, the quality of the system overall, and what each individual space might contribute to that. Next slide, please. Moving on to urban greening very quickly. We haven't got a lot in the data so far on urban greening, but there's an awful lot on the way. At the moment, we've got the existing 250-metre greenness grid, which actually maps percent man-made surface. So the converse of man-made surface is assumed to be green, rightly or wrongly. That's fairly general. It's fairly rough and ready, I guess, really, but it's also quite narrow. It's just percent man-made surface. We want to use this grid to pin in an awful lot more information, which until now we haven't been able to do, particularly tree data. We've had major issues finding a source of tree data that we can use, is OGL-able, isn't going to cost us an arm and a leg, and we can turn into a product that can go out on the site. We think we've found one. We're just playing with it at the moment. So something to do with trees will start to embed itself in this grid, alongside a lot of work that we're currently doing. I call it functionality and needs. These are thematic maps, some of which are going to be focused on various aspects of urban climate change adaptation, so heat vulnerability, urban air quality. We're looking at urban food production. Not quite sure if we'll have something that we can use, but we're looking at it. And we're planning some work to look at the water agenda around SUDS and possibly drought vulnerability as well. So next slide, please. And finally, new kid on the block for me, urban tree canopy. I've said we had a problem with tree data. We haven't quite sorted it. If we have sorted it, we can start to look at tree canopy in the urban environment and to develop an approach. I think there's a particular focus emerging around tree canopy in residential areas. So a lot of work to do here. We may probably not have something for 2.1, but going forward into 2.2, a much better understanding of the tree canopy and the urban environment. Again, probably pinned back to that 250-metre grid. Next slide, please. This is basically me. I'm just wrapping up saying, as I've said, we are building version 2. I've changed the date to January in this slide, but I still think March, April is more likely, but it will be coming out sometime in the earlier part of next year. Crucially, it's crucial to understand that one of the big changes is the date. All the population-related mapping in version 1 is pinned to census 2011. And we are changing the date from 2011 into version 2 to become census 21. And that will assist us with the whole sort of change detection exercise that we want to undertake as well. So if you're looking at the current data, never forget you're looking at census 2011. And all the other stuff I've mentioned, we're hoping to bring at least some of that out into the mapping. We are interested, we're trying to develop something around health and green infrastructure, might not be ready even for the spring, but also in addition to that, further blue infrastructure work, especially looking at experiential quality indicator development, which is potentially a really interesting piece of work. All that and trees too, well, I hope so. My final slide, if we just move on to the next one, only remains for me to say that's it. Thank you for listening. And at this point, I will hand back control to Kate Collins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was brilliant. So I'm now going to hand over to Lee, who's going to chair the Q&A session. Conscious that we've covered an awful lot in today's session, and we may only have a sort of 5 or 6 minutes worth of Q&A, but we'll do our best to answer those most popular questions. So can I ask all of our speakers to kindly turn your cameras back on, and we'll get started. So just to highlight again, we'll probably need to wrap up at around 3:25. Thank you.
Oh, those were great presentations. Thank you so much, all of you. We've had a lot of questions and a lot have been answered in the chat already. I think, Gemma, you've been really great on that as well. So I want to start off with a question for all of the panel, all 3 of the panel, which is a sort of general thing. One person asked, if we could do one thing to improve green infrastructure, what would it be? First off, Jane, please. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I'm here now. Thank you. That's a fantastic question. Really challenging. One thing can you repeat the question, please, again?
Sure. If you could do one thing to improve green infrastructure, what would it be?
I think it would be forming a partnership for a local area around green infrastructure, and making that really inclusive, and engaging a wide range of stakeholders and developing a vision for that area. And that would help to be a really good starting point to a strategic approach for green infrastructure. So it's quite a high level response, but it would then flow down into all the other GI actions. Thank you.
And Gemma?
Thanks, Lee. I'm going to say, if I could influence one thing, it would be to see a kind of a revolution where the development industry really understands the value of green infrastructure, and we're not so much in a battling place where we have to defend and advocate and champion nature in the planning process, that whether it's individual developers or the volume house builders as collectives, there's a meaningful kind of shift where actually all of the local government partners that we've got here in the room today are not fighting the corner for nature, but actually the plans and master plans that are coming forward have already integrated green infrastructure, because landscape professionals and ecologists were on board from the earliest possible stage, helping to drive those developments forward. And I know there's some comments coming through about how it's often an afterthought and it's contrary to density. So I want to see that shift where high quality green infrastructure actually is the thing that makes a development work. And so there's a recognition of that.
Thank you. Thank you. So Martin.
It's a tough one, and I think I'm going to say that we are increasingly aware of the fact we're facing various emergencies: climate emergency, nature emergency, health emergency, and there are people like me, and I've probably a lot of people on this call who are out there doing our best and have been for a long time. Well, I'm getting on a bit. I don't know about you. And for me, I think what's really missing is that we're not educating our kids from day one in the importance of these agendas. There are whole generations of kids that grew up without any sort of natural environment education at all. I'm actually one of those. The only reason I'm involved in the natural environment is because I was personally interested. Nobody taught me a damn thing, not at school anyway. So I would get natural environment in all its guises into mainstream education for kids from primary level upwards, so that we are growing a generation of new adults who will replace the old ones like me.
Thank you. That's great. So now I think we've got about 2 minutes for one more quick question, probably, or maybe two. No, we can't really stretch to two. So there's a question about the difference, the urban tree canopy cover standard. Working with the criteria to make sure that we're considering also types of trees we planted. So what the questioner was saying, is there a conflict between tree cover versus smaller trees that we need to have? I think this probably is surrounding, how tree cover's measured. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, question for either Jane or Martin, I think.
Thanks, Lee. So the tree canopy cover standard has been developed with local context being the primary driver, and it acknowledges that there will be situations that require smaller canopied trees to be planted because of the inevitable constraints imposed by the surrounding environment and infrastructure. Selecting the right tree for the right place is critical, and the guidance for the standard articulates this. So it acknowledges that it may be difficult to achieve the locally set tree canopy cover target in certain specific situations, but it will be possible to compensate for this shortfall by having an increased ambition elsewhere within the local authority's area. And this can include identifying locations where there are opportunities for larger canopied trees. And then for major new developments, the standard also acknowledges that larger canopied trees can be integrated from the start by designing and creating places and spaces that accommodate them, and then they can contribute to an overall increase to meet the targeted percentage tree canopy cover that's set locally. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, I'm sorry, we've sort of run out of time on the question. I'm going to have to hand back to Kate. But anyway, thank you all, everybody, for putting questions in the chat, and thank you, panel, for answering those ones. So,
thanks very much, Lee. So I just want to say thank you again to Lee, Gemma, Martin, and Jane for the session today. It's been really informative, and we've covered so much. So yeah, thank you again, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.